There are languages that carry power not because of what they say but because of who is allowed to speak them. There are dialects that exist in the shadows of history, spoken only by those who understand that language is not just communication. It is a weapon, it is a claim of authority, it is a declaration of legitimacy that transcends modern power structures and reaches back into centuries of accumulated tradition. This is the story of a woman who cleaned other people's homes for survival, who stumbled upon a language that had been hidden for centuries, spoken in whispers by people who believed they were safe from discovery because they spoke in a tongue that no one around them could possibly understand. This is the story of what happens when someone outside the circle of power learns to speak the language of power itself. When the invisible becomes visible, when the silent becomes loud, when a woman who was supposed to be invisible uses the very language that was meant to keep her invisible to shatter the authority of the people who had dismissed her completely. Her name is Sofia Kowalski, and her life has never been remarkable by any conventional measure. Sofia is 42 years old and she has spent the last 23 years working as a professional cleaner. Not by choice but by necessity, not because she desired to spend her life moving through other people's spaces making them pristine, but because cleaning was the only work available to her when everything else had been taken away. She was born in Warsaw, Poland, to a family of musicians. Her father was a concert pianist of some renown, a man who had performed in the great concert halls of Europe, a man whose fingers could coax beauty from the keys of a piano in a way that moved people to tears. Her mother was a violinist, a woman whose interpretation of the classics was considered innovative and brilliant. She had 3 older siblings who all inherited the musical talent that seemed to run through her family like water through their veins, like the blood that connected them, like the legacy that should have been Sofia's inheritance. But Sofia inherited something different. She inherited her grandmother's love of language, of history, of the kind of deep knowledge that comes from reading books rather than performing on stages, of spending time alone with ideas rather than performing them in front of audiences. While her siblings practiced their instruments, while they attended concerts and competitions, while they built careers in music, Sofia read. She read everything she could find about Polish history, about the Renaissance, about the periods when Poland was a great power, about the language that had been spoken in those courts, about the old Polish dialect, the royal dialect, that had been used by nobility from the 15th to 17th centuries, a form of Polish that incorporated elements of Latin, of French, of Italian, that had been the language of power and learning and refined discourse. When Sofia was 18, her father died suddenly, a heart attack while performing at a concert at the Chopin Museum in Warsaw. The family's financial situation collapsed almost immediately. Her mother struggled to maintain the household. Her siblings scattered, one to Berlin, one to London, one to Paris, each seeking musical opportunities that Warsaw could no longer provide. Sofia stayed. She cared for her mother. She worked whatever jobs she could find. And when her mother eventually died, when Sofia found herself alone in Warsaw with a high school education, with no specialized skills that the modern job market valued, with no family wealth to fall back on, with no prospects beyond basic survival, she became a cleaner. For 23 years she moved through the homes of wealthy people, making their spaces pristine, remaining invisible, existing in the margins of other people's lives. She was good at her work. Meticulous, discreet, trustworthy. She was the kind of cleaner that wealthy families wanted. Someone who would not steal, who would not gossip, who would not intrude on their privacy, who understood that discretion was not just a professional quality but a way of being, a way of moving through the world. Clients would request her specifically. Sofia, they would say, is the best. She understands discretion. She is reliable. She becomes part of the furniture, present but unnoticed. But Sofia's real life existed in the books she read late at night in her small apartment in the Praga district of Warsaw, in a neighborhood that had been rebuilt after the Second World War, that carried in its streets the weight of history, that was filled with people like her. People who had been displaced, who had lost everything, who were trying to build lives from the fragments of what remained. She read extensively about Polish history, about the Renaissance, about the periods when Poland was a great power. She read about the royal courts, about the language that was spoken in those courts, about the old Polish dialect, the royal dialect, that was used by nobility from the 15th to 17th centuries. She read academic papers written about the language's grammar and syntax. She studied the phonetics of pronunciation, the subtle inflections that gave the dialect its particular beauty and power. And over the course of 15 years, Sophia taught herself the royal dialect. She found old books, ancient manuscripts, academic papers written by scholars who had devoted their lives to understanding this language. She spent years of her life that other people would have spent on entertainment, on relationships, on living, learning a language that no one spoke anymore, a language that had been dead for centuries, a language that existed now only in texts and in the memories of scholars and in the occasional whispered conversations of people who understood that language was a form of power, that to speak a language was to claim the right to speak, that to master a dead language was to resurrect. Something that the world had tried to forget. 5 years ago, Sophia was hired by a family named Karpowski. The Karpowski family is one of the most powerful crime syndicates in Poland. The organization specializes in everything from human trafficking to money laundering to the distribution of hard drugs across Eastern Europe. The family is run by a man named Alexander Karpowski, who is 58 years old and who has built his empire through ruthlessness, through strategic relationships with corrupt government officials, through an absolute refusal to tolerate betrayal or weakness. Alexander is married to a woman named Magdalena, and they have 3 adult children. Jakub, who manages the distribution side of the operation, Susanna, who handles the legitimate business fronts, and Piotr, the youngest, who serves as Alexander's enforcer and personal security. Alexander lives in a massive estate outside Warsaw, a compound that includes his primary residence, 3 guest houses, a gym, a sauna, and grounds that are monitored by security personnel 24 hours a day. The main residence is a palace, really, a building that was constructed in the 19th century by a nobleman, that was seized by the Soviet government during the Cold War, that was eventually returned to private ownership after the fall of communism, and that Alexander had purchased with money whose origins he had taken great pains to obscure. Sophia was hired to clean the main residence 5 days a week, a job that paid significantly more than her other cleaning work, but which required her to sign non-disclosure agreements, to submit to background checks, to agree that anything she observed on the property would be treated as confidential, that she would speak to no one about what she saw or heard in that house, that her discretion was not just a professional courtesy but a legal and binding obligation. For the first 2 years Sophia saw nothing remarkable. She cleaned the rooms, she maintained the spaces, she remained invisible. She observed that the family was wealthy, that there were meetings held in the study, that there was tension in the household. The kind of tension that comes from relationships that are strained by power and money and the weight of secrets. But she saw nothing that she couldn't already infer from the fact that they employed her, that they were obviously engaged in criminal activity, that the Polish government wanted desperately to prosecute them but lacked the evidence, that the people in this house were people who had learned to hide things, to operate in the shadows, to exist in a space where the normal rules did not apply. But everything changed on a Tuesday morning in March when Sophia was cleaning the library. A room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, with expensive furniture, with a fireplace that had never been used, with a collection of books that suggested someone in the household had intellectual pretensions, someone who wanted to appear cultured, someone who understood that power required more than just violence, that it required the appearance of sophistication. The door to the study next door had been left slightly ajar, and Sophia heard voices coming from that room. She shouldn't have been able to hear them. The walls were thick. The sound insulation was professional, expensive, designed specifically to ensure privacy. But the door had been left slightly ajar, and the 2 women in that room were speaking in a dialect that Sophia's conscious mind didn't recognize, but that her subconscious mind, trained through years of obsessive study, understood perfectly. The voices belonged to Alexander's mother, Konstancja, and Alexander's wife, Magdalena. Konstancja Karpowski is 75 years old, and she is a woman who has been removed from all official positions within her family's organization, officially retired, living in a guest house on the estate where she supposedly spends her time with gardening and with her grandchildren. But Konstancja is the person who built the original Karpowski operation, who created the relationships with government officials, who understood the architecture of power in a way that her son, for all his brutality and intelligence, has never fully comprehended. She is the one who made the strategic decisions that allowed the family to expand. She is the one who understood how to navigate the complex world of Eastern European organized crime, how to maintain relationships with the Russian mafia, how to balance cooperation with competition, how to use leverage and blackmail in strategic alliances to maintain power. And Konstancja spoke the royal dialect fluently. Not as a learned language, not as an academic exercise, but as something inherited, passed down through her family, a language that her own mother had spoken to her during childhood, a language that carried authority because it connected her to a world before communism, before the Soviet Union, before the modern nation-state had obliterated the old power structures. The royal dialect in her mouth was not a historical artifact. It was a weapon. It was a claim of authority that transcended her official position, that suggested she had access to power sources that went deeper than the criminal organization, that went back into the history of Poland itself. Sophia stopped cleaning. She stood perfectly still and she listened. "Alexander is weak," Constantia was saying in the royal dialect, her voice carrying the tone of absolute certainty, the confidence of someone who had spent 75 years observing the world and understanding it completely. "He has allowed the Americans to infiltrate his operations. He has permitted the federal prosecutors to gather evidence. He does not understand that power requires constant vigilance, constant restructuring, constant willingness to eliminate threats before they fully emerge." Magdalena, Alexander's wife, responded in hesitant Polish, not the royal dialect but modern Polish, the language of the present day. She was asking permission, seeking guidance from her husband's mother, acknowledging through her use of modern Polish that she understood the hierarchy, that Constantia held authority that transcended her official position in the household. "What do you propose?" Magdalena asked, and her voice contained fear, uncertainty, the knowledge that she was speaking to a woman who had the power to reshape the trajectory of her life. "I propose that we remove Alexander," Constantia said, with the kind of casual tone that one might use to discuss replacing furniture or reorganizing a garden. "We will make it appear to be a heart attack similar to what my husband experienced 30 years ago. The doctors here are cooperative. The investigation will be perfunctory. And Jakub will assume leadership of the organization. He has demonstrated greater strategic capacity than his father. I will serve as advisor the way I did with his father, the way I did with his grandfather before him. We are a dynasty, Magdalena, and dynasties require strong leaders. Alexander has become weak. It is time for him to be replaced." Sophia felt her heart rate accelerate. She was listening to a plan to murder Alexander Karpowski. She was listening to his mother describe his assassination as though it were a mundane business decision, something that needed to be done, something that had to happen for the good of the organization. She was listening to conspiracy, to the discussion of a serious crime, and she was doing this while technically employed by the family, while under contract to maintain confidentiality, while existing in a legal gray area where the very act of hearing this conversation might be considered a violation of her employment agreement. "Piotr will not accept this," Magdalena said, still speaking in modern Polish, still deferring to Constantia. "He has always been close to his father. He will resist. Piotr will accept it because he will be given a choice," Constantia said, and her voice contained the kind of certainty that comes from having made many such decisions, from having enforced her will on people many times before. "He can accept the new structure and maintain his position as enforcer, reporting to Jakub instead of Alexander. Or he can object, and he will suffer the consequences that come from standing against family decisions that have already been made. He is not intelligent enough to challenge me. None of them are." Sophia moved away from the door carefully, silently, her mind spinning with what she had heard. She was listening to a woman describe the murder of her own son with the kind of clinical detachment that suggested she had done this before, that she understood murder as a tool, that she was comfortable with the idea of eliminating people when they became inconvenient. She finished cleaning the library without being detected. She completed her other tasks. She left the estate at the usual time. But she didn't go home to her apartment. Instead, she drove to the National Library in Warsaw and she sat in the reference section for 8 hours, reading about the history of Polish royal dialect, about its structures, about its syntax, confirming everything she had heard, understanding that what she had heard was not just one conversation, but evidence of a language that she had been studying for 15 years, spoken in a context that made her years of study suddenly, terrifyingly relevant. Over the next 3 days, Sophia made a decision that would reshape her entire existence. She made contact with a federal prosecutor named Tomasz Karski, a man who had been investigating the Karpowski family for 15 years without ever building a case strong enough to prosecute. She told him what she had heard, and Tomasz immediately understood the value of what she was offering. Inside information about a plot to commit murder, information that could leverage the entire family structure against itself, Information that could turn members of the family against each other, that could give federal prosecutors the tools they needed to finally prosecute one of Poland's most significant organized crime operations. "Can you get a recording?" Tomasz asked her, understanding that audio evidence would be infinitely more valuable than testimony alone, that a recording of Konstantia's voice speaking about the murder would be impossible for a defense attorney to challenge or explain away. "I can do better than that," Sofia said. "I can get them to say more. I can create situations where they feel safe speaking. And I can ensure that everything is documented." Over the next 2 months, Sofia used her position of invisibility to orchestrate a surveillance operation from inside the Karpowski estate. Working with Tomasz, who obtained the necessary warrants, she placed listening devices throughout the guest house where Konstantia lived. She positioned a hidden camera in the library, capturing video of conversations that Konstantia and Magdalena conducted. She recorded everything. She documented every incriminating statement, every confession, every revelation about the crimes that the Karpowski family had committed. And she listened to plan after plan, conspiracy after conspiracy, each one revealed in the ancient dialect that Konstantia used when she believed no one who mattered could understand her. She learned that Konstantia had been the architect of the original expansion into human trafficking. She learned that Konstantia had personally ordered the death of a rival gang leader's family, a woman and 3 children, as part of a territory dispute. She learned that Konstantia had been systematically transferring assets out of Poland into accounts in Switzerland and Singapore, preparing for a scenario where she might need to flee the country. She learned that Konstantia had poisoned her own husband Stanislav 30 years ago, because he was becoming too sentimental, too interested in legitimate business, not ruthless enough for the empire she was building. Every conversation confirmed that Konstantia had been the true power behind the Karpowski organization for decades, that Alexander was simply a figurehead managing day-to-day operations, that even Jakub, who everyone assumed would be the successor, was ultimately just another tool being used by an elderly woman who had never surrendered control, who understood that power was something that had to be seized and maintained constantly, who believed that the world operated according to principles of ruthlessness and cunning that transcended ordinary morality. 3 months into the surveillance, Tomasz had enough evidence to move forward with the federal prosecution. The plan was to arrest the entire family simultaneously, to separate them, to prevent them from coordinating a legal defense. But Tomasz suggested something to Sofia that she had never expected. He suggested that she confront Konstantia directly. "Why would I do that?" Sofia asked him. "Because she won't believe that any of this came from you," Tomasz explained. "She won't believe that someone like you, a cleaner, a servant, someone she considers beneath her, could possibly understand what she was saying, let alone have the intelligence to orchestrate this level of investigation. And there's value in her understanding just before she's arrested, that her secret language wasn't secret at all, that the one person she completely discounted as irrelevant was actually the one who brought her down." Sofia agreed. It was a form of closure that she needed, a way of reclaiming her visibility in a situation where she had been forced to remain invisible, a way of demonstrating that understanding could come from unexpected places, that the people at the bottom of the hierarchy could sometimes see things that the people at the top could never comprehend. 2 days before the federal agents were scheduled to execute their warrants, Sofia requested a private meeting with Konstantia. She sent a message through Magdalena. The cleaner wanted to discuss a personal matter. Could Konstantia spare a few minutes? Konstantia, curious and apparently feeling secure, agreed. She was accustomed to people coming to her with requests, with problems, with situations that required her intervention. She didn't imagine that a cleaner might have anything significant to say. She didn't imagine that her authority could be challenged by someone she had dismissed as invisible. They met in the library on a Wednesday evening. Konstantia was sitting in her favorite chair, a chair that she had chosen specifically because it was positioned in a way that allowed her to observe anyone who entered the room, that gave her height advantage, that reinforced her sense of authority. Sofia stood before her, not in the posture of a servant, not in the submissive stance that she had maintained for 5 years, but in the posture of an equal. And Sofia began to speak in the royal dialect, with a fluency and precision that made Konstantia's face go absolutely blank. "Pani Konstantia," Sofia said, using the formal address but also using the ancient grammar that came with it, that elevated both the speaker and the person being addressed to a realm beyond the modern world, that suggested a kind of equality that transcended the normal hierarchies of the household. I have listened to your conversations. I have understood your plans. I have documented your crimes. And tomorrow the federal government will arrest you, your family, and everyone associated with your organization. Constantia stood up, her face flushing with rage. You cannot possibly understand the language you're speaking, she hissed, responding in modern Polish, reverting to her native tongue because she was too shocked to maintain the royal dialect. You're cleaner. You're illiterate. You're beneath me in every possible way. How dare you presume to speak the language of queens and kings? I'm a woman who has spent 20 years studying the language of queens and kings, Sophia responded, and she continued in the royal dialect, her accent perfect, her grammar immaculate, her understanding of the ancient declensions and subjunctive constructions flawless. I'm a woman whose family included musicians, whose ancestors understood culture and history and language. I'm a woman you made invisible because I was convenient to dismiss. But invisibility gave me access. And access gave me power. And now, your secret language, the language you believed protected you, the language you spoke when you thought no one could understand, has become the mechanism of your downfall. Constantia began to laugh, a sound that was high-pitched, almost hysterical. It was the laugh of someone experiencing the dissolution of their entire reality, the moment when the worldview that had sustained them for decades suddenly collapses. You're a peasant, Constantia said, still in modern Polish, unable to speak the royal dialect anymore, unable to maintain the persona of power and authority that the language had provided her. You're nothing. You understand nothing. My family will destroy you. They will find you and they will make you regret. Your family is already being arrested, Sophia interrupted, still speaking in the royal dialect, still maintaining the tone of absolute authority that the language conveyed. By now, federal agents have taken custody of Alexander, Jakub, Susanna, and Piotr. They're all in federal custody. And you will be arrested in approximately 2 minutes, when those agents arrive here. And every word you spoke, every confession, every plan, every revelation of a crime, has been documented and recorded and will be presented as evidence in a federal court. When the federal agents arrived, they found Constantia sitting in her chair, completely silent, the ancient language that had been her weapon stripped away, leaving her with nothing but the reality of her situation. The trial that followed became one of the most significant organized crime prosecutions in Polish history. The evidence was overwhelming. 50 hours of recorded conversations, video documentation, financial records, witness testimony. Constantia was convicted of murder, of conspiracy to commit murder, of human trafficking, of money laundering, and of approximately 40 other federal crimes. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. Alexander was convicted of conspiracy and money laundering, receiving a 30-year sentence. Jakub received 25 years. Susanna received 15 years. Piotr, who negotiated a plea agreement in exchange for testimony against his mother, received 10 years and would be eligible for release after 5. But what happened to Sophia was perhaps more remarkable than the legal outcomes. She became a witness in a case that was covered extensively by international media. She was a woman who had been invisible, who had used that invisibility to dismantle an empire. She was a woman who had educated herself in an ancient language, who had used that education as a weapon. She was a woman who had proven that knowledge, true knowledge, deep knowledge, specialized knowledge, could transcend social class, could transcend expectations, could shift power dynamics in ways that no one could predict. After the trial ended, Sophia was offered something that had never been offered to her before: opportunity. A documentary filmmaker named Joanna Lewandowski approached her with a proposal. Would she be interested in creating a film about the history of the Royal Polish dialect, about how it had been spoken throughout centuries, about how it had been used as a language of power and privilege, about how it had been almost completely forgotten? And would Sophia be willing to be featured in that film, to demonstrate her fluency, to become the public face of a language revival project? Sophia agreed. The documentary, released 2 years after Constantia's arrest, became an international success. It screened at film festivals around the world. It led to an academic career opportunity for Sophia. A university in Warsaw offered her a position as a lecturer in historical linguistics, specifically focused on the Royal Polish dialect and its contemporary applications. She would teach students about the history of language, about how languages carry within them the weight of entire civilizations, about how the words we choose to speak and the languages we choose to learn can reshape the world. But before Sophia accepted that position, before she began her new life as an educator and scholar, before she allowed herself to enjoy the recognition that had come from her role in bringing down one of Poland's most significant organized crime operations, she did something that she needed to do. She visited Konstancja in prison. The visit took place in a federal penitentiary on the outskirts of Warsaw. Sophia sat across from Konstancja in the visiting room, separated by a table under the observation of guards. Konstancja was 78 years old now. She looked smaller than she had in her home, diminished by the loss of context, by the absence of power structures that had sustained her sense of self. She looked like what she actually was. An old woman who had built her entire life on the foundation of violence and manipulation, and who had been dismantled by someone she had dismissed as insignificant. "I wanted you to understand something," Sophia said to her in modern Polish, not the royal dialect, because she wanted the conversation to be purely personal, completely human without the artifice of ancient language. "The power you felt came from exclusivity. Came from believing that only people like you could speak the language of kings. But power of that kind is always fragile because it depends on others not knowing, on others remaining ignorant. The moment someone else learns the language, the moment someone from outside your circle understands what you're saying, that power evaporates. That's what happened to you. That's why you fell." Konstancja looked at Sophia with something in her eyes that might have been respect, or might have been rage. It was impossible to tell. "You were never supposed to be able to do what you did," she said quietly. "I was never supposed to be able to do a lot of things," Sophia agreed. "But I did them anyway. And I think that's the real lesson here. The assumptions we make about who can and cannot accomplish things, they're usually wrong. They're usually based on bias, on prejudice, on the belief that certain kinds of people are capable and certain kinds of people are not. You assumed I was incapable because I was a cleaner. You assumed I was ignorant because I didn't come from your world. But capability and knowledge don't announce themselves. They don't require permission or acknowledgement from people of power. They can exist quietly, can develop in hidden places, can wait for the perfect moment to emerge." Sophia left the prison and she never returned. She began her teaching position at the University of Warsaw. She became recognized internationally as an expert on historical linguistics. She published 2 books, both of which became academic standards in their field. She traveled to conferences around the world speaking about language and power, about the ways that communication can be weaponized or can be used for connection. And 20 years later, when Konstancja died in prison, quietly without fanfare in a prison hospital, Sophia attended the funeral. Not as an act of forgiveness but as a kind of closure. She spoke briefly at the funeral in the royal dialect, for an audience of exactly 3 people. A Catholic priest, a federal official and a prison chaplain. She spoke about Konstancia's life, about how power can corrupt completely, about how fear of losing control can lead to the destruction of everything one has built. When she finished speaking, she used the royal dialect to quote something that had been written 600 years ago, something attributed to a Polish queen whose name had been nearly forgotten by history. "Language is the bridge between power and understanding. To lose the language is to lose the right to rule." But here's what I want to emphasize before we finish this story, and that's the nature of power and invisibility. Because Sophia's real power didn't come from the royal dialect, didn't come from her education, didn't come from any extraordinary ability. Her power came from being willing to be seen as worthless, from being willing to accept a position of servitude, from understanding that sometimes the most powerful position you can occupy is the position of someone that others have decided doesn't matter. This is a lesson that applies far beyond this specific story. In our culture, we celebrate visibility, we celebrate people who demand attention, who command rooms, who make themselves impossible to ignore. But there's a kind of power that comes from the opposite. From being able to move through spaces without being noticed, from being able to gather information, from being able to understand systems while remaining outside of them. Sophia's cleaning work was not a limitation. It was the foundation of her power. The invisibility that she was forced to accept became the very thing that allowed her to see things that powerful people missed, to understand conversations that were supposed to be secret, to gather evidence that could not be challenged or dismissed. Her position at the bottom of the hierarchy gave her access that people at the top could never have imagined. The very fact that she was dismissed, that she was not perceived as a threat, that no one thought she was intelligent enough to understand a dead language, was what allowed her to acquire the information that brought down an empire. So I want to ask you a question. What information have you gathered just by being observant, by being quiet, by being willing to listen to things that people assume you won't understand? What power have you accumulated without realizing it, simply by being in the right places at the right times? What knowledge have you gained by being underestimated, by being dismissed, by being invisible? Because I think many of us have more power than we realize, we just don't recognize it because it doesn't look like the kind of power we've been taught to value. Drop into the comments and tell me, what language do you speak that other people don't? What knowledge do you have that gives you power in unexpected ways? And tell me where you're from. Are you from Poland? Are you from Europe? Are you from somewhere completely different? Tell me your location, tell me your story, because this community is built on people who understand the hidden architecture of power, who understand that knowledge changes everything, who understand that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who are clever enough to remain invisible until it's too late. And if this story moved you, if you felt the satisfaction of Sophia dismantling an empire through education, through persistence, through refusing to remain invisible when it mattered most, please hit that like button. We're targeting 11,000 likes on this video because this story deserves recognition. This is a story about a woman who had nothing but her mind and her determination, and she used those two things to bring down a criminal empire. That's worth celebrating. Subscribe right now because there are 13 more stories about the fallout from the Karpowski case, about the federal agents who worked with Sophia, about the other families who were allied with the Karpowskis and who began to fall once the original organization collapsed. We're going to explore the successor's dilemma, where we follow Jakub Karpowski's younger brother, who was offered the chance to take control of the organization after Konstantia's arrest, and who had to decide between continuing his family's criminal legacy or breaking free entirely. We're going to investigate the prosecutor's secret, where we discover that Tomasz Karski, the federal prosecutor who worked with Sophia, had his own reasons for bringing down the Karpowski family, reasons that go back 20 years and involve a crime that Konstantia committed personally. And we're going to tell the story of the new language, where Sophia's success leads to a broader movement to resurrect and preserve ancient languages, to understand what we lose when we allow languages to die, to recognize that language carries not just communication but entire worldviews, entire ways of understanding reality. We'll follow how Sophia becomes an advocate for linguistic preservation, how she helps establish programs to teach dead languages, how she demonstrates that every language that disappears takes with it not just words, but entire ways of thinking, entire architectures of understanding. I'll see you in the next video. Don't be late because the language of power is about to be spoken in ways you've never imagined before. The words we choose to speak, the languages we choose to learn, the knowledge we choose to acquire in silence, they matter more than we know. And sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do is to learn to speak in a language that was never meant for them, to claim the right to knowledge that others believed was exclusive, to understand that power can be seized by anyone who is willing to work for it, who is willing to study, who is willing to remain invisible long enough to gather what they need to break through to visibility.